Hello and welcome. Today we're going to practice learning the names of the books of the Bible. Now maybe you already know the books of the Bible, and if you do, of course, that's great. But we still hope you'll watch the video. You're likely to learn more than you think. You may learn some skills and methods that will help you learn other things about the Bible. Learning the Bible books, of course, is worth doing because the Bible is a book worth knowing. The Bible is an amazing book. In fact, one of the amazing things about it is that it's actually not just one book. It's more like a library that has all kinds of different books. But more than that, when you put the books together, they all work together to tell one amazing story. And that, of course, is the story of Jesus Christ. So I want you to think about opening the Bible. I want you to think of that in terms of going to God's library. Now later in this video, we'll begin to talk about what some of those kinds of books are in the Bible library. But for now, we just want to get started by learning the names of the books. Now maybe you've tried this before and you've had lots of trouble remembering all the names of the books of the Bible. So we're going to try to give you a way that hopefully will make learning the books a whole lot easier. Before we get started, here are some questions to test yourself. Question 1, how many books are in the Bible? Question 2, what are the two main parts of the Bible called? And then question 3, how many books are in each part? Maybe you're watching this with your parents. Take a few minutes and talk about those questions. You can pause the video if you need to do that. Let's talk about the answers to the questions we just asked. There are two main parts in the Bible. Both of them are referred to as testaments. You have the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now in the Old Testament you have 39 books. Then in the New Testament you have 27 books. You can see there we're going to add them together, and if you do that, you get a total of 66 books. The Bible has 66 books in this vast library that is given to us by God. Do you know the names of all 66 books in the Bible? Maybe you already do. Maybe you don't, but it doesn't hurt to practice regardless. It's been my experience that even adults need to practice the Bible books every now and again. I know I do. So let's try together to name the books of the Bible. Let's go ahead and start with the Old Testament. Go ahead and pause the video here in a second, and what I want you to do is practice saying the Old Testament books for one of your parents. And once you're done trying to say the books, you can go ahead and click play to continue. So go ahead and hit pause and practice the Old Testament books. Now let's go ahead and try the New Testament books, and we're going to do the same thing. Here in a second, go ahead and pause the video and practice saying the New Testament books for your parents. Go ahead. So how did you do trying to say the books from memory? Maybe you're wondering, is it really necessary for me to know the names of the Bible books? I think the answer to that has to be yes. Now, we don't have to know the names of the books in order to please God. What we really need to know is the content of the books. I get that. But I'll tell you, knowing the Bible is a lot easier if you know the names of the books in order. Let's just say you're trying to find a Bible book for whatever reason, working on your Bible lesson or listening to a sermon, the preacher's telling you to go somewhere in your Bible, or maybe you're just looking up a passage on your own. It's just a lot easier when you don't have to go to the front of the table of contents and look up the page number first, or even worse, just try to hunt it down until you get lucky and find it. Knowing the books makes studying the Bible a lot easier. Another reason knowing the books is important is, again, the books are part of a larger story. We need to know what the books are about in order to know how they fit together. And that all starts with learning the names of the books. So the question we want to ask is this. We need to know the books, but how do we learn the Bible books? Well, one answer to that question is it comes down to being interested in it. Maybe you're interested in reading different kinds of books. Maybe you've read several books in a series that interests you. Maybe it's the 39 Clues or Harry Potter, just to name a couple of examples. I've met a lot of people that can name every single book in those book series and other book series. Why is it that people know the names of those books? Well, because those books are interesting to them and they spend time with those books. Well, we really just need to do the same thing with the Bible. So how are we going to learn the names of the Bible books? Well, again, it does come down to being interested in it, and the more time certainly you spend with the Bible, the better you'll learn the names of the books. Something else, though, that you can do is just to find a fun way to learn them. And there are really lots of ways to go about that. There are lots of songs out there that teach the Bible books. Of course, music is always very effective. Just knowing more about the Bible stories can help. But here's one way that I have learned that I've used a lot to help others learn the Bible books, and I hope that it helps you too. Now, I'm sure you recognize those colored blocks in the picture on your screen. They are called by different names. There's one name that most people know them by, and that's the name Legos. Lego, of course, is a brand name and the most familiar name when we're talking about this sort of building block toy. Well, how do Legos work? Well, I don't really need to tell you that. You start with a plan. Your Legos come with a booklet. You're trying to build something specific. And what you start doing is you start putting together smaller pieces until before you know it, you've made something much bigger. So you use the smaller blocks and piece them together until you've built something much greater. Well, that's basically the approach we want to take in learning the Bible books. And you can use this for learning verses, memorizing verses, or learning entire books of the Bible. You can take this approach and apply it to a lot of different kinds of learning when we're talking about the Bible. You can really use this for learning all sorts of things outside the Bible as well. What we want to do is we want to begin by learning a small group of books. So you have a small group of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 books, say, and you want to learn just that group. Once you've learned that first small group, you want to repeat the process and learn another small group of books. Say 1 or 2 or maybe up to 5 books in a group. So you'll learn one group and then you'll learn another small group. And then just like Legos, you take your 2 small blocks or 2 small groups and you simply put them together to form a larger group. And so you put these 2 small groups together that you've learned, and then you learn the larger group of books. And that's really how you go about learning the Bible books. You just keep learning small groups of books and then adding them into what you already know until you've memorized the entire list of Bible books. So let's try that for the Bible books. Let's try that approach. Now, I've taken all 66 books of the Bible and I've divided them up into small groups. Now, sometimes we can just put 1 book in a group. Other times we put 3 books in a group or 4 or 5 in a group. And just to make this fun for this video, we give each size group its own color. And so you can see that the yellow group is 1 book per group, green is for 3, blue is for 4, and red is for 5. We've even chosen the right Lego piece for each group. You can see that for each group, the Lego piece has the same number of studs or bumps on it as the number of books in that group. Just one more way to try to make this a little bit easier. So are you ready to try this? Let's get started and try to learn the books of the Old Testament. And by the way, if you ever want to go back and re-watch parts of this video, for instance, if you need more practice, just feel free at any time, use your mouse and go back and do that and you can ask your parents for help if you need it. You can also pause the video at any time. We'll say that many times throughout the video, of course. Okay, let's have some fun learning the Old Testament books. For the Old Testament, we're going to use these different blocks or groups of books that you see on your screen. We can divide the 39 books of the Old Testament into groups of either 3 books, 4 books, or 5 books in a group, and you can see those there. And by the way, I'll give you a little hint. In learning the Old Testament books, you'll use each of these groups on your screen 3 times. So if you were actually building Legos, you would need 3 red bricks, 3 blue bricks, and 3 green bricks, and put those together, and by the time you were done, you would have learned the Old Testament. You'll see what I mean as we go along. Okay, we're going to start with the first 5 books. You can see here, of course, because we're talking about a group of 5, we're using the color red with our red Lego brick here. And the very first 5 books of the Bible in this first group are as follows. You have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Let's say those together. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now try saying those yourself. Now you can look at the screen until you think you know them and then try looking away. Maybe you need to pause the video to buy yourself some time there. Have one of your parents help you. But go ahead and try saying these 5 books yourself. Now let's try them one more time together. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay, so do you think you could remember those books? That's the first block we're going to use in putting together a knowledge of the books of the Bible. And the good news is this is the largest size group you will ever have to learn, a group of 5 books. So you're already off to a good start, so good job. Let's go ahead now and learn another block. This is going to be a smaller group. You'll notice that we're using the color green, which means this next group only has 3 books in the group. In fact, the next 3 groups we'll learn all have 3 names in each group. So we're going to have 3 green bricks here in a row. So here's the name of the first group, the names of the books in the first group. You have Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Let's try practicing that. Let's say it together. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Go ahead and pause the video and practice saying those 3 books for your parents. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Go ahead. Okay, you have that one down? And by the way, you'll notice our first group, our red group, is over there on the left side of your screen, and we've actually made it look like a giant red Lego piece. So go ahead and try saying those 5 books again. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay? Now try saying the green group of 3 again, the one we just learned. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Okay, are you ready to try to put these together like Legos? Let's try all of these books together. Try to close your eyes and see if you can remember them. Here we go. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And do you remember the next 3? They are Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And again, if you ever need to pause the video to practice, just do that. Now, if you know those books, you know 8 of the 39 books of the Old Testament already. So great job. Okay, so we're ready now to learn our next group of 3. We've moved our first group of 3 up to the top of our screen there. And we're going to learn our next group of 3. And here are the names in that group. You have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now you might be thinking already, wait a minute, that's 6 books, not 3. And you're right about that. We've called it a group of 3 because basically only 3 names are used. You have Samuel is the name of 2 of the books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. You have the name Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the name Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So you really only need to remember 3 names. And of course, keep in mind that with this group of 3, yes, we're really talking about 6 books, but all you have to do is throw first and second in front of each of the names and you'll have the 6 books. So let's try practicing just the 3 names in order. You have Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Let's do that again. Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. Now let's go ahead and add the first and second in. You have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Okay, let's add that now to the previous group of 3, the previous green block. So you have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and we'll add the 1st and 2nd, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So if you need to, go ahead and pause the video and practice putting those green bricks together. Okay, so do you have that memorized or have a good understanding about how to do that? I'm sure that you do. Let's, in fact, go ahead and adding in the red block here. Let's add our red brick in, and we'll start at the beginning. We'll go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then our first green group, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And our second green group, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now there's one more group of 3 that we want to learn here. Remember, we said we were going to learn 3 groups of 3 in a row. So you had Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and the third group is Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Let's go ahead and practice those. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Try and say those yourself. Can you say those? Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And once you learn those, again, you can try adding it to one or both of the other green groups. And then when you're ready, you can try adding the red group in as well and just saying all of them together. Now, by the way, the order in which we're learning the books is the order in which they appear in the Bible. So make sure that you get these groups in order as you try to say them all. Let's say all of them one more time. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then you have 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and then you have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Okay, so are you ready to put what we've learned all together? Let's put our Legos together. Now again, at any time you can pause the video, but you have the first 5 books of the Bible. That's our red group there. And then you have the 3 groups of 3 that follow it, and they're all represented by the color green. So you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then a group of 3, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. You can see we're snapping our Legos together here. And then you have 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And then, of course, you have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And so you put all of those together and you have a group of 18 books. Now, before we introduce more groups, let's pause for a moment to talk about something I think is very important. Because we're not learning the Bible books together because we like putting Legos together. This has nothing to do really with Legos. It's about learning the books in order. Remember, we said that opening the Bible is like going to God's library. We're trying to become more familiar with God's library. So here's what the Bible books we've learned so far might look like if they're positioned together on a library shelf. And this is just a picture to help you visualize. You have the first 5 books. You'll notice that they're red. Those are books that tell a lot about Moses and God's old law that he gave the Israelites. And then the next 12 books are about the history of the Israelites for hundreds of years after Moses. That's Joshua all the way through Esther. So we call these books books of law and books of history, books that talk about God's law for Israel and how Israel behaved, and books that show us whether Israel in the centuries that followed did a good job of following God's law, of obeying God. Okay, so we're going to learn now another group of 5 books. We'll call this our second 5 because, of course, our first 5 were Genesis through Deuteronomy. So here we have another red block or brick to help us know it's a group of 5 books. And here are the names of those 5 books. You have Job, followed by Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Let's say those again together. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. You can go ahead and pause the video and practice those yourself if you'd like. Okay, so here is our second group of 5, and for now, we're not going to try to say these with the other 18 books we've already learned. We're just going to learn these 5, and here in just a minute, we're going to look at another book of 5, or another group rather, of 5 books. And then we're going to try to put those 2 red groups together into a group of 10. So let's try this group of 5 one more time. You have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Now once again, let's look at how these books might look on a library shelf. And this group that we've just learned, the books in this group are a different kind of book than anything we've looked at before. Before we had law and history. Well, these books have a lot of poetry in it, a lot of very wise sayings in them. In fact, some people will call them simply wisdom books or wisdom literature or books of poetry. So that's why we call these wisdom and poetry. Okay, so now we're ready for our third group of 5. And again, you see our red color, our red brick, to tell us it's a group of 5. And this group of 5 has the following books in it. You have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Let's go ahead and say these again. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Now let me just offer a word of encouragement, okay? Don't give up. We're adding a lot of books here to your mind. Just try to learn these 5. In fact, maybe the way to learn these is just pick one group of books every day to learn, or maybe one group a week if you'd rather go at that pace. And then once you really know that group, then try adding another group in. You don't have to learn all of the books in one video. We're just showing you how to do it. So let's go ahead and try to say this group of 5 with our previous group of 5. We won't put that other group on the screen, but do you remember what that group starts with? It starts with a short name beginning with J. It's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Now, let's go ahead and add those 2 red groups to some of the green blocks that we learned before that. Remember, we had 3 groups of 3 in a row, all represented by the color green. And we have the last 2 of those here on the screen. So you have Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, followed by Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Well, those are followed up by the 2 red groups we just learned. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. By the way, if you have your own Legos at home, you don't even have to do this the way we're doing it. Pick your own colors, your own sizes. Do this however works best for you. We're just showing you one way to do it. Okay, so let's return to our library shelf and update what's on our shelf. Now, the last group we learned was Isaiah through Daniel. Those books represent a different kind of literature than anything we've looked at so far. We've had law, we've had history, we've had wisdom literature or poetry. These are books of prophecy. Men like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel were special men called prophets who spoke God's message to Israel. Okay? Now you'll notice that we have the wording major prophets. The reason why they're called that is simply because of the size of these books. They're very long, most of them. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel all have lots and lots of chapters, and they're certainly longer than other books of prophecy we're going to look at in just a second. So these are major prophets. You can be thinking about what the other books of prophecy might be called if these are major. Okay, so think about where we're at with learning the books. We've had 3 groups of 5, and we've had 3 groups of 3. Okay, so what we're going to do now is add one more color. We're going to have some groups of 4, and then we'll be done with the Old Testament. So our last 12 books in the Old Testament, we're going to divide those up into groups of 4 books each. So you have 3 groups of 4 here, and of course we're using blue as our color for those groups of 4. I'm just going to list off the names of the books in these groups. We're not going to spend a lot of time practicing them because you already have the idea about how you're supposed to learn these books in small groups and then piece them together. So here are the names of the books in each group. In the first group of 4, you have Hosea, Joel, Amos, and Obadiah. And then in the second group of 4, you have Jonah, Micah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. And then in the third group of 4, you have Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So I want to encourage you to practice those on your own. You can even, again, hit the pause button right now and practice those right now. But hopefully, now you're starting to get the hang of how to do this. And we hope that it's helpful to you. And so now we'll return back to our library shelf, and you'll notice that we have all of our blue groups on the shelf, if you will. So we have these last 12 books of prophecy, and we're calling these minor prophets, and that's simply because they are shorter books, shorter than the other books of prophecy from Isaiah through Daniel. And you'll notice that we've preserved our color scheme here, our red and our green and our blue, so just to help you remember the size of the groups that we're trying to remember. Later on in our presentation, we'll show different colors on these books, but for now, we just want you to get the idea of learning these books in groups. Okay, so we're now ready to look at the books of the New Testament. We're going to use the same method. Now, we're not going to spend nearly as much time on this because you really have the hang of this now. You know how to use this Lego method, if we can call it that, of learning the book. So we don't need to go through this as slowly as we did the Old Testament. Now for the New Testament, we're going to make one change to the kinds of groups that we use. We're no longer using a group of 3, so you see our green brick is gone. But there will be a couple of times where we'll use a group with just 1 book in it, and so that's why we have the yellow brick there. So let's get started. The first 4 books of the New Testament are probably some of the easiest to learn. They all talk about the life of Jesus on earth, and those books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's practice those together real quick. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's our first group of books in the New Testament. For our next group, we're only going to put 1 book in it, and that's why we're using the color yellow. And that book is called the Acts of the Apostles. Usually you just hear it called the Book of Acts or simply Acts. This is a book of history. It gives the history of the church and the apostles for several years after Jesus left the earth and went back to heaven. So the second group is just a single book. So really, in terms of putting Legos together, it ought to be easy to put this one with the previous group. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then you add to it the book of Acts. Okay, now we're going to put several groups on our screen. We want to learn these together, and you'll notice that they're all called Paul's letters. One of the people we learn about in the book of Acts is named Paul. Paul became an apostle. He went everywhere telling people about Jesus, and he wrote to a lot of people about Jesus and about the teaching of Christ. In fact, he wrote about half of the books of our New Testament. These books are actually letters that were written to churches, also to individuals. But we can learn the names of Paul's letters by dividing them up into a group of 5 and 2 groups of 4. And so here are the names of those books. You have Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians here in our first group of 5. Then you have two groups of four. The first of those groups is Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, and 2 Thessalonians, and then 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And again, you should feel free to pause the video as you need to in order to practice each group and then put them together and learn them as a larger group. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and put the rest of the New Testament books on this slide. You have two groups of four, and those are called other letters in the Bible. Those letters are as follows. You have a group of Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, and 2 Peter. Then you have a group of four books called 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. Now, about Hebrews, some think that Hebrews may have been written by Paul. That very well may have been the case, but since no one really knows for sure, we've just put Hebrews in one of these groups of four. And then there's just one book left. It's a book of prophecy. It's a yellow group. And in that group, we have one book, the book of Revelation. Before we're through, let's just try one more time to visualize what all the Bible books would look like on a shelf at the library. Here is a depiction of the Old Testament books. Now, we're no longer using the colors that we did before. There still is some blue and green there, but we're using them in a different way. We've picked the colors here to go with certain types of books. And you can notice that the history books are green, for example, and the books of prophecy are purple. And you're going to notice when we get to the New Testament, those two colors are used there as well. And so the Old Testament has books of law, history, wisdom, and prophecy. And here in the New Testament, you also have history and prophecy, but you also have gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, and then also lots and lots of letters. Letters make up quite a bit, book-wise, of the New Testament. But once again, you see all different kinds of books. So do you see what we mean when we say that the Bible is an amazing book? It's an entire library of books, all from God, all working together to tell one wonderful story about Jesus and why God sent him to earth. So we need to know the books of the Bible so that we can know that story better, so we can know God better, and so we can learn how to please him. So that's our time for this session. That's our video on the books of the Bible. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.